So everything the U.S. and Israel has done will be to discourage diplomacy and encourage a harder line from Iran. And who can blame them for after what they've been through with Israel and the U.S.?
So recently, Aaron Maté went on Judge Napolitano's podcast to talk about all the ramifications in the Iran war between the U.S. and Israel versus Iran. And even if you follow Trump's stated agenda for this conflict, why this event was totally counterintuitive. I can't wait to hear what he says. He's an incredible journalist, so let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Is the foreign policy of the United States now subordinated to the demands of Israeli leaders?
I think that's fair to say. Trump used diplomacy with Iran as a ruse to provide cover for Israel's attack. He, even after Israel started bombing Iran, he then gave a 2-week deadline, which was also used as another ruse to facilitate his own bombing of Iran. And why would he care about bombing Iran? It's not in the interests of anyone's national security. Iran wasn't threatening the U.S. Iran, as its own intelligence agencies had concluded, did not have a nuclear weapons program. So why would he bomb Iran? Because Israel wanted it, and that's what his pro-Israel donors wanted, the Mary Matelson. It made them very happy. It made the rest of the world a more dangerous place. So, yeah, it's safe to conclude from Trump's statements, even though today now he's saying he's mad at Israel, that the overall thrust of it certainly is subordinate to Israel.
Yeah, and trust me, if he was really mad at Israel, all you have to do is threaten to withdraw aid, or actually withdraw aid, or actually denounce Netanyahu in public for undermining what was his foreign policy agenda and his foreign policy goal, which was to negotiate with Iran. Aaron's right. He lured Iran, with Netanyahu probably in on the plan the whole time, into a state of lull, a sense of security, such that they didn't believe this initial strike was coming, but it did. And the signs were written on the wall for this. The Trump delegation, including Steve Witkoff, went from an original mandate of no nuclear weapons program to eventually no nuclear enrichment whatsoever. And that's a very different perspective, because the latter is a non-starter no one would agree to. Not just Iran, but no country, because it would have shelved the nuclear energy program. So Aaron's totally right. And, who could trust the U.S.? This is Israel first policy, and it has been for a long time. This certainly isn't the first episode of that happening, but I agree with Aaron.
When he told a reporter on Air Force One, and we've all seen this several times, referring to Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard's testimony under oath, not her own opinion, but the consensus of the intelligence community that Iran did not have any nuclear weapons and hasn't been attempting to create one for 22 years. He told the reporter, "I don't care what she says. I believe otherwise." What was that otherwise belief based on? Information from Netanyahu, from this company called Palantir that the government pays hundreds of millions of dollars to surveil people?
It was based entirely on Israel and the spin that Israel was putting on already existing intelligence. The picture that you get from all the reporting that's come out from people who I've spoken to, also who Max Blumenthal spoke to, him and Anya Parnpol at the Gray Zone had a really big scoop at thegrayzone.com. Speaking to a Trump administration official who told them that basically Israel was feeding the U.S. with the intelligence picture that Trump sees, which is that Iran is close to developing a nuclear weapon. And there are certain key figures in the administration, especially CIA Director John Ratcliffe, who are basically representing Israel's point of view. But this wasn't the point of view of the U.S. intelligence community. And recall, during Russiagate, people like John Brennan, James Clapper, they handpicked certain analysts and they cherry-picked intelligence. So a Trump supporter might look at that experience and say, well, based on that, why should we trust what the U.S. intelligence community says? This is far different, because at this stage, when it comes to the assessment of Iran's nuclear weapons program, or non-existent nuclear weapons program, what Tulsi Gabbard presented in March and still holds true today, that's the result of the consensus view of the intelligence community. So that's multiple agencies, many analysts, all coming to the same conclusion. So all that happened was Israel gave a different spin on the existing intelligence. They didn't have anything new to provide. I know for a fact from someone who I spoke to on the inside, who said there's no intelligence assessment internally, even up until just a few days ago, that was saying that Iran is weeks away from being able to produce a nuclear weapon. So that all came from Israel, and that's who Trump chose to believe, not
That was war propaganda. I mean, it just is striking. You can see Tulsi Gabbard's verbal report, the threat report that she presented in front of Congress 6 weeks ago, where not only was Iran not building a nuclear weapon, there was no evidence they even reconstituted their program, defied just a few days ago by her going to Twitter and saying, Americans have intelligence that Iran's a few weeks away. This was war propaganda. I think the gray zone is fantastic. I have the utmost respect for it. The only question I have regarding this is if it was Israeli intelligence that was shooting this out there, it must have been developed or generated after Netanyahu was actually interviewed and said, well, even Netanyahu was saying he thinks Iran's probably a year away, maybe 13 months. And indeed, this kind of stuff came up just a day before the U.S. decided to bomb Iran. It seems too coincidentally timed to match what the regime war propaganda was. So, yeah, I have no doubt this was not U.S. intelligence. If it was Israeli intelligence, Netanyahu didn't repeat it. Actually, Tulsi Gabbard and what she said about it was far more radical in terms of how soon it would be for Iran to acquire this than even Netanyahu was willing to say. But it clearly was in alignment with the war machine, what they wanted out of this, and the neocon preference.
His own intelligence agencies.
Surprise, surprise, Netanyahu lied.
Yeah, that's right. And there's an article in the Washington Post today that explains why. It's nothing to do with Iran's nuclear energy program or its non-existent nuclear weapons program. This had to do with the fact that Netanyahu saw an opportunity because in previous Israeli attacks, Iran's air defenses took a hit. The ones last year. And so Netanyahu saw a narrow opportunity before Iran's defensive capability could be restored. So therefore, he seized the moment. That's what all this is about. Seizing a moment where Netanyahu and Trump perceived that Iran was weak and therefore more vulnerable to an act of aggression, which is what they carried out.
That's true. And if this was any other country sabotaging U.S. foreign policy aims, again, that was to negotiate with Iran. And I do believe it honestly and earnestly started out as that. If another country, just decided to bomb Iran to undermine U.S. foreign policy interests in that regard, the U.S. might bomb that country. But instead of denounce that and say, Netanyahu, no, this is unacceptable. We want peace with Iran under this deal. He just joined and collaborated with Netanyahu to do this strike. And it didn't need to happen. Innocent Israelis died. Innocent Iranians died. What? For what reason? Just to show that they weren't willing to be what the neocons always said they would be and try to wipe Israel off the map and, consummate their death to America chance by destroying U.S. military forces in the region. They didn't even do that when they were threatened by the full force of the United States and Israel. So this completely ruptures the Zionist and neocon narrative regarding Iran, and it doesn't really solve anything. If anything, this just encourages Iran to now build a nuclear weapon as soon as possible with whatever uranium was saved, which sounds like a lot of it because a lot of the reporting coming out of Iran now is that, some of these underground tunnels were empty and they didn't even destroy, I believe, one of the 3 facilities. So their program of enrichment isn't decimated. It isn't destroyed. They need it for nuclear power anyways. And this is going to keep going on. The neocons will still clamor for regime change. Netanyahu will still generate this false threat. And meanwhile, Israel will maintain its own secret nuclear weapons program. What do you know?
Why did Trump spend $100 million dropping 30,000-pound bombs on empty tunnels from which the nuclear material and their equipment had been safely extracted days and weeks before?
Well, this is where you have to enter into the realm of psychology and mental health. There's been reporting that basically Trump didn't like the fact that Israel was getting most of the credit on Fox News for the Israeli attacks on Iran. So Trump wanted in. And normally you can maybe dismiss this stuff as just as deceptive leaks aiming to make Trump look bad. But based on his behavior, I think it's quite plausible that this was just part of this. He wanted to look tough. Maybe he thought in his head he could do some damage. But Iran knew this was coming. So as many of your guests have discussed, they moved out their enriched uranium prior to these strikes. So therefore leaving their stockpiles intact. So I think there's a psychological factor here, wanting to look tough on Fox News and get credit. And then there's the, what are the political reasons? What's the strategic aim of trying to deprive Iran of its right to enrich uranium, because we know it's not stopping a nuclear weapon, because everybody knows Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon, and they were negotiating in good faith to put that in a binding agreement, which
Yeah, and they never wavered from that. They never altered what their perspective on this deal was. Only the U.S. did. They went from no nuclear weapons to no nuclear enrichment. Trump repeated that several times. That was the difference between late May and early June. It was widely reported on. He's totally right about this.
Trump and Netanyahu sabotaged. Well, Max Blumenthal has talked about this. If you undermine Iran's ability to enrich uranium, then you're basically undermining their ability to meet the needs of their population. And what goal does that serve? It serves regime change. If there's unrest, if there's even more discontent on top of the existing sanctions that the U.S. has imposed, then if you deprive Iran of its right to produce energy and meet its domestic needs, you increase the chances of regime change. And there's also, I think, just the fact that Iran has tethered its right to enrich to an expression of its sovereignty. There's something psychological here in the eyes of foreign actors like Trump and Netanyahu, who just have such contempt for Iran's existence as a state that resists U.S.-Israeli dictates, that even an expression of Iran's sovereignty must be destroyed just to teach them a lesson. In the same way that when Hamas carried out a one-day operation on October 7th, Israel had to carry out a more than a year-and-a-half-long genocide just to teach the natives a lesson, that you don't raise your heads to the masters of the region, which is Israel and the U.S.
Yeah, a lot of the psychological effect of that probably comes into play. And another thing he said at the beginning of this segment where he was talking was about the movement of uranium. If I was Iran, I'd be constantly moving uranium, in the run up to this thing. This was news for a long time, for months. There was that story a few months back about how Trump had stopped a war in Iran. Well, if that leaks out, what makes you think that they're not going to try to use safeguards to protect their nuclear enrichment? I would. If I was in control of that regime, I would. And not only that, again, I would start building a nuclear weapon, because the U.S. doesn't flirt with regime change in North Korea. We know how that goes. It takes it off the table. Even the neocons don't talk about it anymore. But what happens is when powers do give it up, like Gaddafi, they're toppled by the U.S. and a NATO alliance, which wasn't defensive in purpose, by the way. That was an offensive NATO excursion. So that's what happens, and that's the truth about Iran's perspective in this. And as evil as you think Iran's regime is, or Israel's regime, whatever you want to say, these are actors that actually practice things that are in their own interests at times, and they didn't react in the way that all the neocons said they would.
Under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which of course the United States and Iran signed and Israel hasn't, wasn't whatever they were doing in those tunnels to enrich uranium lawful, monitored, and approved? Now, it was monitored and approved by a corrupt organization, which I'll ask you about in a minute. But there's no question but that Donald Trump attempted to, he didn't succeed, destroy a perfectly lawful activity in a sovereign country with no provocation.
It was completely lawful. And the Israeli-U.S. attack was completely criminal. Now, here's where tactically, I think Scott Ritter has raised a really interesting point, that tactically, even though Iran was acting lawfully, was it smart for them to do? And I'm not endorsing his argument, but I think he raises a fair point that's worth considering for those of us who want to look at this, in the most fair-minded way, and the most, in thinking strategically, is what is the best way to handle pathological aggressors in the U.S. and Israel who are committed to your destruction. And Scott's argument is that by enriching at a higher level than is needed for peaceful purposes, because Iran was going up to 60%, that helped give Israel and the U.S. a pretext to bomb. Now, one could argue to the contrary, that the U.S. and Israel would have bombed no matter what. So whatever Iran did didn't matter. The Iranian argument was that we needed to enrich to 60% to give ourselves some leverage. But when you're dealing with, and this is where I think Scott's argument is worth considering, when you're dealing with pathological aggressors like the U.S. and Israel, whose entire strategic identity is oriented around destroying countries that aren't under their control, then you have to think about doing, or at least I think it's worth considering what Scott raises, which is not giving them any possible excuse that they can use to justify them attacking you. I think it's an interesting question that Scott's raised.
Yeah, I can see both sides of that one 100%, because in Iran's perspective, that's a deterrent without actually having a nuclear weapon, and drawing, a lot of ire from other countries in that regard. It floats out there that, like, oh, if we really try to pursue this, we could have it. But then that did serve as some of the pretext that they're using. Hey, they're enriching more than they need for medicinal purposes and for energy. Well, fair enough. But also, I can see the other side where, it does give the pretext for potential war. Either way, I'm glad this resulted in what it did. The Iranians practiced remarkable restraint in tipping Trump off toward their retaliation strike, and Trump seemed to be aligned with it the whole time, knowing that he would blow out, I think, like 13 out of the 14 missiles out of the air, and one was quote-unquote set free. This was not calculated to even do damage. It was only calculated to save face. And the Iranian regime had a, tough call to make there. If they really responded in kind, I think that would have been the impetus for regime change. So I don't give Trump actually credit for, how this turned out more than I give Iran credit for dealing with it, because Iran really could have incentivized regime change if they would have fired in kind, done a lot of damage to either Israeli areas, which they had done retaliation strikes because Israel struck them, but also attacked U.S. soldiers. That's what Israel wanted. They wanted U.S. soldiers to get attacked, drawn into this war, and for there to be a regime change, the same one Netanyahu's always wanted. He said he wants the Libya model there, and thankfully that didn't play out. Iran deserves enormous credit for that, no matter, again, how evil you believe their government is. And I don't buy all that propaganda, by the way. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan. I wouldn't be a fan of that culture. I much prefer living in the United States. But you have to acknowledge that they didn't handle this in the way that would have drawn the most warfare, the most negative consequences, and, a lot of prayers were answered in that regard.
The murders of Iranian senior officials, not the Ayatollah, but senior Revolutionary Guard, senior scientists, senior military. The Economist magazine this morning, which is well worth reading. They have a bias, but it's a great publication. I've been devouring it since I was a teenager, which for me is a long time, is arguing that the next generation is far more hardline than the people who were killed. And Israel may very well have produced the opposite reaction from what it intended. Is that argument worth exploring?
Well, sure. I mean, when you only know Israel and the U.S. as being just violent aggressors, and not just in this current phase, but for a long time. I mean, look at the history of Israel, of the U.S. and Iran, and go back to 1953, the coup, U.S.-backed coup that overthrew a nationalist government that made the mistake of trying to use Iran's resources for its own people, not Western oil companies. So therefore, it was regime changed, and then the Shah, the violent tyranny of those years. And then, of course, the U.S. supporting Saddam Hussein in the 1980s in his war on Iran. And then, the many, many more years of aggression, including shooting down a civilian airliner and the sanctions. I mean, so people.
Yeah, Google Iranian Air 655. That's a story a lot of people don't know. There was a commercial plane shot down by the United States in the context of the, Iran-Iraq war. At the time, the U.S. was supporting Iraq, and it killed 290 people, I believe, and it was innocents. The U.S. government claimed that it had been misidentified as an F-14. Maybe true, but this was a complete disaster. This would have been considered a declaration of war had Iran done this to the United States. It would have been an impetus for regime change, especially before the rise of independent media. So that's something I'm so glad he's pointing out. So few people point that out.
Growing up with that, of course, you'll become even more hardline and defensive. And then, I think another, like a related question is on the issue of nuclear weapons. So the Ayatollah, yes, he's issued this fatwa against nuclear weapons. When he goes, will a successor see the same? Or even will he even change his mind now, given the persistent aggression of Israel and the U.S. and the use by the U.S. of diplomacy to further that aggression? So everything the U.S. and Israel has done will be to discourage diplomacy and encourage a harder line from Iran. And who can blame them for after what they've been through with Israel and the U.S.?
Totally agree with Aaron. That last point said it all. Who could blame them if they want to pursue nuclear weapons right now? He talked about the fatwa that Khomeini had against nuclear weapons. Well, that might be for optics, for show, just to kind of signal to the world that's not what he wants. And maybe his mind does change now. You couldn't blame him. You know, Israel and the United States came within the cusp of launching a regime change war against him and might still. You know, Netanyahu and the neocons are still going to talk about it. They're still going to promote it. They're still going to talk about Iran as an existential threat that's going to wipe Israel off the map. They chant death to America. Oh, no, not that. Words are violence now, I guess. They're going to keep saying that to drum up this imaginary threat, this threat that the neocons and Netanyahu have always drummed up. And by the way, they'll never say, well, Iran has nukes. Iran has nukes now. Iran has nukes. They won't say that. They'll only say they're within weeks of acquiring nukes. They're within days of acquiring nukes. They're within months of acquiring nukes. Netanyahu's made a career out of it. He's said it since 1992 in like 20 or 30 different times. You can check the examples on that on the internet. They're plentiful, and they've spanned the course of, over 3 decades. He's going to keep doing that because he has to keep saying that to drum up the war propaganda. See, this isn't about a genuine threat. It's about propaganda for regime change. And the underlying purpose behind this, I think more than anything, timed right now, is to take eyes off what's happening in Gaza. That's clear. And the U.S. is complicit in what's happening in Gaza. It is bankrolling Israel's genocide in Gaza. If you don't want to call it a genocide, fine. I don't want to argue about that. I just want to argue about that it's not within the U.S. interest to do that. And it's the worst PR stunt of all time. It's the worst PR disaster of all time, I should say. They're talking about making concentration zones in Gaza now and squeezing out all the populace. They've reduced Rafah to rubble. Children are pulled out from that rubble all the time. We have to see pictures and videos of it on TikTok, and that's why they wanted TikTok banned, by the way. And they still do. Many still do. It's not because of China. The whole China thing's a cover. China might collect our data. No, the NSA collects our data, not China. China might have interest in that, but that's not the reason they want to ban TikTok. So it's all wrapped up in the Israel lobby and the Israel lobby's influence, not only in the United States, on our elected officials and on Trump. AIPAC and other connected causes have given Trump more than $200 million. Talked about that a lot too. But I think Aaron is so spot on here, is that this really did nothing. A lot of the Trump supporters are going to celebrate this like this is an incredible thing. Trump averted war, etc. What it really showed is Trump was willing to tank U.S. foreign policy aims for the sake of Israel for no reason. And now we're not going to have peace with Iran. I still hope there's some chance that a new JCPOA happens. It's the only good thing in foreign policy I think Obama ever did. But of course, it pissed off the Israel lobby and the neocons because it took the regime change off the table. Well, we saw that regime change floated out and almost visited in the last few weeks, and it wasn't a good thing for America, especially as Trump still says he wants to establish peace in Ukraine. You can just withdraw aid. You don't have to negotiate with Russia there. That would force a peace, withdrawing aid. But now Russia is going to trust the U.S. even less than it already did after it's expanded NATO, overthrown the Yanukovych government in 2014, put Aegis missile systems basically on Ukraine and Russia's border, and continued to exacerbate and fund this war, even though Russia clearly controls the Donbass and it doesn't seem like that's going to change. Those are the negative ramifications, and I think Aaron points out a lot of them. As to whether they used Israeli intelligence for the weeks away thing, it's hard to say. I don't doubt that, but Netanyahu didn't have that memo at the time he first did an interview answering these things after the first Israeli strike. But what do you guys think below? Was this a disaster? What are some other negative ramifications of it I might be missing here? Do you think Aaron was on point? Let me know down below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. Please consider becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon patron and support it. I'd bow to you in appreciation if you do that. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.